This is the sixth talk in a series of 7 designed to join up the arts and the sciences. It was first given on the 16th of April 2009 and is being given today on the 18th of December 2015. Jesus of Nazareth as a northern invader, or Recooking Houston Stewart Chamberlain, a biological explanation of the Bible. The view presented in this talk is that in the Christian story, Jesus of Nazareth, on account of his messianic actions and utterances, and on account of certain details of Middle Eastern geography, should be seen as a northern invader, or inheritor, or person who is pressing a claim to inherit, and that in his person, Greek culture is mugging and co-opting Jewish tradition. Further to this, Jesus' invasion from the north is a central element in something called a New Testament. And this New Testament follows an Old Testament in which many other muggings are embedded. Jewish culture is a mugging of Israelite and Samaritan tradition in, for instance, the Davidic invasion and empire establishment story. And note also the Jewish claim that the Jews themselves constitute the entity, Israel. In turn, and going back further in time, Israelite culture is mugging Canaanite, Hittite, and Hurrian traditions. Joshua's invasion of a promised land in Western Palestine. And in turn, Canaanite, Hittite, and Hurrian cultures are appropriating Akkadian tradition. And Akkadian culture, in turn, the story content of Sumerian art. The Abraham story, the journey from Ur to Haran. The systemic or formatted structure of biblical content has apparently not been obvious to generations of readers, and the reason for this is a furious subverting and reinventing of history on the part of the invading muggers. Reinventions that have, in some cases, only quite recently been exposed by scholarship, as with the studies on the Davidic and Solomonic empires. But how should these reinventions be characterized? The key feature is the telling of a story around the wrong way. To take over a pre-existing culture's tradition, you need, it seems, to allege that you pre-existed the pre-existing culture. Think especially in this connection of Jesus' whopper assertion, "Before Abraham was, I am." John 8:58. In the body of the talk, we look at the mechanics of Jesus' invasion of biblical terrain, finishing up with the epitomizing chapters 2 and 4 of the Gospel of John. The stories of the marriage at Cana and the Samaritan woman at the well, with their theme of the previously unrecognized and unacknowledged husband moves in. Part 1, Introduction. A, theoretic one, the northward drift of civilization as a literary problem. The theory that I've been outlining in a number of talks in this biology and literature series holds that history is completely systematic, which is to say that the last 5,000 years functions according to a discernible, fixed system. Civilization starts in the south and then drifts northwards. The southern civilization forms a symbiosis with peripheral northern areas on which it rather cautiously encroaches and from which it needs to extract resources, both material and human. This works nicely until the peripheral groups decide to invade the south, causing potentially a complete reshuffling of the cards, whereby, in one significant outcome, the northerners actually come to run the southern civilization, preparing the way for history to repeat itself till there are presumably no more easily exploitable resources and no more easily exploitable human beings, a point which might well have in essence been reached in the last century. Here's a schema of the northward drift from A to J. This is the northward drift. The slight complication is that Akkad is probably just to the north of Babylon, but nobody really knows where Akkad is. So this is the way history rolls out, with northerners taking over, but somehow coming to an accommodation with the southern group. Today, however, we're going to assume that people are reasonably well acquainted with the idea of historical system, and move on to the derivable idea of the northern drift of civilization as a literary problem. When the takeovers occur, B from A, C from B, etc., they are likely to be accompanied by a great deal of turbulence. Here we are not just talking about the turbulence that arises from military predations, the massacring and brutalizing of an invaded population, nor that which arises after state-orchestrated dislocations, such as the transporting of whole subject populations like those which famously followed Assyrian battlefield victories. The point we are focusing on sees the turbulence go even further still, all the way into the heads of intellectuals and artists, who begin to experience the world completely differently. We might say that they start to see the world changing before their mental eyes. So the historical turbulence generates a mental turbulence. One particular aspect of the generation is the dragging of time between the historical event and the writing down of the text inspired by it. A length of time that is well beyond the time required for the creative process, with its own turbulences, and which gives rise to something we are calling in this talk literary lag. Let's try to explain this lagging process with some specificity. For a time, after an historical upheaval, the intellectuals, writers, and artists might be confused about who exactly is in control. South to north scenario. When the South expands into peripheral or northern territories, its economic opportunism doesn't lead to an unambiguous political control. In the usual situation, the tribes of the northern areas have their own leaders and their own intertribal affiliations. Despite some inevitable frictions, these leaders are frequently left in power if they are able to give the impression that they are people the Southerners can do business with. This is a surefire recipe for a future of grinding turmoil, a political scene chock full of strongmen troublemakers and hated, craven collaborators. North to south scenario. The confusing politics of invasions from the north can be described with greater precision. There are in fact a number of rather distinct invasion come aftermath scenarios. 1. The northerners invade and then leave taking their booty. The south is not seriously affected. 2. The northerners invade and then leave taking their booty, but the south has been decapitated, generating a power struggle. 3. The north invades, then stays to rule the south with a co-opted southern bureaucracy. And there are still other permutations. 4. They invade, they go back home, but they still try to rule the south through proxies or puppets, etc. Eventually, however, there is a subsiding of the turbulence, both historical and mental. The literary lag has run its course, and the intellectuals are able to see which way the wind is blowing and will write their text from either a southern or northern perspective. Let's take a look at the case of the first takeover B from A, Akkad from Sumer. The chronology of events in Mesopotamia in the 3rd millennium BC is somewhat uncertain. What we can assert safely, however, with regard to the second half of this period is that the major civilization of Sumer is upgrading its trade and political influence in the region to its northwest. Places northwest of Sumer, like Ebla and Aleppo, may have been flourishing centres in their own right and for a very long time, but by the time of the second half of the 3rd millennium, they are falling under the influence of Sumerian civilization. Consider the high percentage of texts written in Sumerian found at the Ebla site, about 80%. Furthermore, Sumerian potentates are describing their realm in this period as the land between the two seas, by which they mean that they rule a land which runs from the Persian Gulf all the way up to the northeast Mediterranean, a wide diagonal of terrain enclosing the full length of the Euphrates. In other words, they not only trade with the northwest, they also claim to own it. So they rule from down here, but they're claiming that they are running all this territory up here. So much for historical background. Now to literature. The staple literary diet of the Sumerians is the Gilgamesh epic. Our contention with regard to this epic is that the fictive geography and the principal characters' movement through it have reference to the historical northern drift of Sumerian influence. The epic deals with a king of Uruk. Uruk is a city deep in the south of southern Mesopotamia. The king, Gilgamesh, leaves his city and goes on a journey to the ends of the earth. In later versions of the story, the ends of the earth locale is the dark forest of cedars, almost certainly a reference to Lebanon, far to the northwest of Sumer, with its famous cedar trees. The poem has, therefore, just like Sumer's historical development, a distinct north movement. But there is a far more precise and obvious connection between history and literature here. It is all to do with the southern civilization's need for wood. Lebanon, or western Syria, is where Sumerians are going to obtain wood for timber and for the resins which go to make adhesive gum, perfumes, and medicines. The connection to the epic lies in the fact that it is a forest where Gilgamesh is going on his spiritual quest. We think it cannot be a coincidence that a great wooded area is of major economic interest to the historical Sumerians, and that is also where the symbol of Sumerian power, Gilgamesh, is going for salvation and immortality. Another point about the Gilgamesh epic needs to be noted especially. In the journey to the end of the earth, notwithstanding the complication of him having a companion, the wild man Enkidu, Gilgamesh effectively undertakes the quasi-military adventure all by himself. In other words, the civilization's aspirations and survival, or salvation, can be summed up in one literary persona. This point is going to be useful when we come to later literature. So about the Gilgamesh epic with regard to lag, we are making merely the fairly innocuous assertion that the Sumerians are meditating on the process of their having moved northward. However, with Mesopotamia's next literary star, Sargon of Akkad, the lag reveals its systemic character much more completely. Sargon is an invader from the north, and we know quite a bit about his invasion of southern Mesopotamia, which cities he attacked and in which order. We also have a memorable story that he washed his weapons in the Persian Gulf, saying emblematically, "I've conquered my way all through the south to the great southern sea." Or, "Well, that's southern Mesopotamia done." That conquest from the north is not, however, how he attains his place in the Mesopotamian imagination for centuries and even millennia to come. That comes through the epic, The King of Battle. The King of Battle tells of Sargon's victory over the Prince of Purushkanda, far to the north in Anatolia. The military action undertaken by Sargon follows a dispute that arose concerning the mistreatment of merchants in Kanesh. The presence of Mesopotamian merchants in the story is revealing with regard to dating. The 23rd century is 3 or 4 centuries too early for merchants in Kanesh. The events described in the poem therefore betray the preoccupations of a much later time and cannot have been composed in Sargon's lifetime. Hence, in summary, an example of something we are calling literary lag, and all in the context of a northerner going south who morphs into a southerner going north. B, Theoretic 2, How to Write a Bible. Let's do a thought experiment. You are on a planet far out in space. We'll call it some other worldia, or S. On this distant planet, a species of some intelligence has come to prominence, and that species has gone on to a phase of high civilization, with centralized governments, bureaucracies, monumental architecture, accumulation of wealth, specialists, professional classes, standing armies, etc. You are a clear-headed but otherwise unremarkable member of this species on S. One day, your ordinary life takes on an amazing turn. From all the millions of some other worldians, you, yes you, have been selected to write or put together a salvational text for this advanced species. You accept, but it's a big task. There is a vast amount of material available: myths, chronicles, prose romances, songs, prophecies, laments, proverbs, letters, and even apocalypses. What are you going to do? Well, first of all, you're going to panic, because all the available material is heterogeneous and ipso facto doesn't go together. And you're going to have to make it so that it does. Here's a suggestion. Why don't you just make stuff up? Even whole stories or whole slabs of history. After all, the people who wrote the text you're likely to be dealing with cannot themselves be entirely innocent of having done just that. There is one major problem. The world you are living in has arrived at a stage where tradition is being written down, so that, unluckily for you, as against previous generations, the accuracy of the rendering of your material can be checked up against records. You seem to be at a complete impasse. However, and here we move on to a second phase of the thought experiment, one day, while fretting about your fate of having been chosen for such a high task and knowing it to be impossible, you walk past a mirror and a truly great idea jumps into your head. In some of the stories of S, there is mention of some preeminent deities and of one especially powerful deity. Why not, by a very trivial sleight of hand, invest this principal deity with your problem of making sense of all the traditional material? Instead of being just a god who has to be feared and obeyed in the old style, he has to, so to speak, earn his own living by taking on the task of being governor and guarantor of all the old texts and be responsible for them being cohesive and making some kind of overall sense. No real violence is going to be done to the traditional material itself. All you need is for the single God to get the single text started and be responsible for it winding up at the close. And with regard to what happens in between, only a few judicious interventions will be required. I think that this thought experiment will help us to understand how the Bible was put together, but it might also help us to understand a lot else as well. Namely, how it was that vast amounts of biblical narrative was put together in the first place. Significant components of biblical content, both genre material and divergent narratives have already involved judicious interventions and judicious assembly. In other words, our luckily selected redactor on S was always and ever. Traditions have always been multiple, both in form or genre and in content, with different versions of the same story. But they can't remain in that unvarnished state. Well, actually they can, and we'll be tackling the question of paradox head-on in just a moment. But for now, let us just observe that the parking together of disparate material is done largely in the spirit of hoping for the best. In other words, you put different material together and just hope that it makes sense. Surprisingly, this seems to work. There are many different, and one could say unintegrated, genres in our own Bible, e.g. myths, chronicles, prose romances, etc. And that doesn't seem to have resulted in any riots of disapproval so far. And in the case of different versions of the same story, the two versions of Genesis, some repetitive accounts of David's career, the books of Kings and Chronicles, and the Gospels themselves, you can stick variant accounts flush up against each other and just hope that that makes sense. But the only reason it does is that, as well as concept God turning up from time to time to reveal his overarching plan, you get an overall coherence from the individual godlike salvational heroes. Patriarchs, warriors, prophets, priests, and kings who enter the text, who are made to enter the text, to judiciously steer the narrative in the right direction. And where is that direction? It's north. Just as we saw in Theoretic 1 with epic heroes Gilgamesh and Sargon, a single hero can take civilization northwards. In Bible world, we can give the examples of Abraham taking civilization from Ur to Haran, understand Sumerian civilization going to the Hurrians, and Moses bringing Egyptian cultural power up to Canaan. To sum up on Theoretic 2, the writing of salvational history involves massaging traditional material into shape to explain to the reader sitting in his chair in the north the odd story of how civilization just fell into his lap. To do this, you just assemble a mess of traditions. You put concept God at the beginning and you put concept God at the end, and you just slip him in at certain appropriate moments to ensure that the desired salvational outcome is achieved. Namely, that the audience for or reader of the text finds himself all throughout his reading aligned with concept God, or the godlike salvational heroes of tradition, finds himself on top of, vindicated in, written into, and ultimately the meaning of history. Safe in the knowledge that there is a power or an agency that oversees the world and which is working in his interests, and which actually has knowledge of where history is or should be heading. Theoretic 3, paradox. In Theoretic 1, we have the real events of real history plus literary lag. The stories follow the takeovers, but at quite a distance in time, with either a northern or southern perspective depending on where the writer is situated. In Theoretic 2, we have the construction of a monolithic medley with the concept of a trans-historical God who starts and ends history and who shifts the human agenda by his own direct intervention or through his proxies. I think 1 and 2 are basically the whole story of how you come to have a Bible. But there's one thing that still needs to be explained, and this arises from both 1 and 2. Namely, the latter-day perspectives of the writers and their audiences, who are always writing and reading at a distance, which gives rise to the abiding paradox of theology, a relentless being wise after the eventism, and a concomitant relentless retrojecting of things which happened late in front of things which happened early, so that everything in salvational history has a back-to-front quality. Let's just explain this first on the macro level. This is what happened in real history. First came men. Actually, first came single-cell organisms, or the Big Bang. But let's cut to a minimum, cut the story to a minimum. So first men, then came shamans and priests, then came gods, and then a very recent development, a single God. But in theology, history happens the other way round. First came the single God, the capitalized entity, G-O-D. Then came the entities that have proceeded from God, sons of God, heroes, priests, prophets, and kings. Then came men. Understand, civilized men. So that's the macro picture for biblical paradox. But let's look at the phenomenon more generally and also at the micro level. The Bible contains many literal paradoxes of the black is white kind. So God says, I am the Alpha and the Omega, i.e., I am both the first and the last, both the initiator of history and the one who's going to bring it to a close. Or, Jesus says, the meek shall inherit the earth. Or, before Abraham was, I am. Or, the last shall be first. In the mustard seed story, you have the idea small can be large. And in the loaves and fishes story, there's a rerun of that idea. So again, small can be large. But these broadly expressed contradictory precepts are not what we are talking about today. Yes, they are probably to be thought of as summarizing endpoints or illustrations of the biblical enterprise, but they are not our primary focus. The paradoxes that we are talking about involve whole slabs of biblical text. In the most general sense, the Bible is paradoxical for reasons we've touched on already. There are many genres. They don't all fit together, and so you resort to putting them side by side and hope for the best. So, paradox in the literal sense of the Greek para, meaning beside, and dox, meaning line of thinking. The method of paradox, however, that I specifically want to draw your attention to is actually in the content itself, the phenomenon of supersession. This content, so characteristic of salvational epic, is of this kind. The superior situation that the world eventually arrives at had its seeds in an earlier, less than superior state of affairs. If you are the writer of a salvational epic, you are not only going to have to demonstrate this, you are going to have to demonstrate it over and over again. The paradoxical aspect of this enterprise can be summed up in this way. Before the superior civilization arrived, and before we can move on to an even better one, there will have to be some basic recognition and acknowledgement that the preceding and preparatory, not quite civilization, was both A, essential, and B, cursed. The continual pointing out of this, let's call it salvational fact, produces a strange method of narration which I call telling the story around the wrong way. In a first phase, the blessed goal, some perfect or highly desirable state, is superseded by an evil state of affairs, so that when the time comes for the judicious interventions of concept God, a marvelous transformation can take place and wrong states of affairs can be superseded by right states of affairs. It's a sort of two-part magical reiteration of the blessed salvational condition. First, a slipping away from it, and then a getting back on track towards it. 3 quick examples. Cain and Abel, the left-handed men of Gibeah, and Paul of Tarsus. 1. Cain and Abel. Cain is a firstborn whose sacrifice offering is rejected by God. Abel is a second-born whose sacrifice offering is accepted by God. In a favourite biblical trope, the firstborn son is cursed, the second-born son is blessed. Compare, for example, Ishmael and Isaac, Esau and Jacob. Why is this a violation of the natural order? Because in ancient thinking, the older person has been sanctioned by time. They are wiser, they have endured more, and they have triumphed over the trials of existence. But what is of special interest here is that the story is told around the wrong way historically. Cain, the agriculturalist, is murdering Abel, the herder of animals. The herders of animals should be the violent transhuman tent people, i.e. the people who are usually carrying out the murder and mayhem in ancient times. The agriculturalists should be the docile, sedentary homebodies. So that is our part one. In part two of the story, the turn, the reversal, the regaining of paradise, the violence instituted by Cain is suppressed by God's intervention with a worldwide flood, and forthwith piety, justice and righteousness are fully restored. 2. The left-handed men of Gibeah at Judges 20:16. By a co-location of stories, the left-handed stone-slinging second-tier warriors of Gibeah are associated with the rape and murder of the Levite's concubine in Judges 19. So, part 1, Gibeah, left-handedness, violence and murder. This is preparing the way for a part 2 that involves a marvellous transformation of the land space that contains Jerusalem, the land of the last tribe to be admitted to salvational Israel, to make up 12 in all, the tribe of Benjamin. Benjamin is a name that means sons of the right, and understand sons of the right hand, and also understand the right-handed men. Furthermore, by a conventional understanding that is not irrelevant to our north-south analysis, they are the sons of the south. In other words, the right-handed men, i.e. concept Benjamin, are one and the same as the southern civilizers. Benjamin is the place of transformation because it is where the first king Saul will come from, and it is where David will invade and accede to a throne. The transformation thereby solves a thorny theological problem. Judah, the spiritual home of people calling themselves Jews, did not originally contain Jerusalem. And once Jerusalem is attained, left has become right, evil has become good, and paradise has once more been regained. 3. Paul of Tarsus. Paul's story is the perfect two-parter to illustrate stories told around the wrong way. First, a persecutor of Christians, then, after a miraculous intervention on the road to Damascus, the spokesman, promoter, and champion of Christianity. So in summary, the two-part structures are a way of telling salvational history. Wrong states of affairs are superseded by right states of affairs. And this is so that the real story of southern aggrandizers and northern invaders of actual world history can be told in a way that a modern reader will approve of, whatever his political persuasion, i.e. whether he is a southerner or a northerner in his politics or general outlook. Part 2, the Christian story. This long introduction will, I think, help us to understand the Christian story found in the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. It will help us to understand, 1, what a gospel is, and 2, who or what Jesus of Nazareth is, and what his life trajectory given in the text is supposed to signify. So, what is a gospel? A gospel is what the Bible is, or what the Bible is in most people's minds, an inviolable zenith of theology. A gospel is an expounding of a theological perfection. By form, it's a salvational epic, and by content, it's an extended paradox. And who or what is Jesus? Above all, he is a northern invader. What exactly is he invading? Answer, Jewish tradition. Let's look at some aspects of these claims. A, Jesus as not Jewish. Many people throughout history have held the view that Jesus was not Jewish, from Marcion in the 2nd century all the way through to the more recent Houston Chamberlain. And we can include here, I feel sure, that distinguished biblical scholar Mel Gibson. There have been people who have understood Jesus not to be Jewish, but rather some sort of freedom-loving northerner. Let's look into this. The first point that needs to be made here, just leaving aside the rather special problem of coming from Galilee, is that coming from the north puts any Jew, no matter how devout, under a cloud of suspicion. The north, for Jews, is where the old kingdom of Israel was. This northern kingdom is considered in biblical text to be a hotbed of cultic irregularity, and the abode of people who commit that highest of all cultic sins, failing to worship at Jerusalem. They worship instead on Mount Gerizim or Mount Ebal, or at Shechem or Shiloh. At least the old northerners are Yahwists, or at least they include Yahwism in their worship. After, however, the Assyrian population resettlements of the late 8th century BC, the north becomes filled with foreigners from all over Mesopotamia, and in Jewish eyes is to be seen as a mongrelized province. But with regard to racial and religious purity, much worse is to come. Greeks. From the time of Alexander of Macedon, a significant Greek population, originally of colonist soldiers, is living in the cities of the north. In short, the northern area by the time of the Roman emperors had become much more cosmopolitan than devoutly Jewish. So, that much by way of background. But what about Jesus himself as not Jewish? Here we have the Gospels themselves as our #1 source. In the Gospels there is an abiding and persistent habit which rises to a high point in the Gospel of John, whereby Jesus' adversaries are denoted the Jews. Even if we make the allowance that these texts were written in Greek and are specifically written by Greeks, in the cases of Luke and John, and contain therefore a certain amount of Greek bias, this repeated reference to anybody who is against Jesus' forward-looking and apocalyptic views as Jews must still strike the reader as odd and notable. Somehow Jesus and his disciples don't qualify as, or are not in the first instance to be considered themselves Jews. And this despite the voluminous quoting of Scripture and the journey to Jerusalem for the Passover. B, what and where are Galilee and Nazareth? First, Galilee. In the time of the Roman procurators, the time of the events or alleged events described in the Gospels, Galilee, where Jesus and most of his disciples come from, is a squarish-shaped province around the west side of the Sea of Galilee. So, Sea of Galilee here, Galilee in Jesus' time. Why is it called Galilee? Because in a much earlier time it was regarded as a threshold area, or liminal point. The Gelil Hagoyim, see Isaiah 9:1, where it is called exactly that, the place which is surrounded by foreigners, literally the ring or circuit of foreigners. Why the circuit? Because back then the Galilee area was much further north than the Roman province, and it came to a sharp northern point, inland from Tyre and Sidon, and had foreigners on all sides. So came up as high as here, and the foreigners on all sides were the Arameans to the north and the east, Phoenicians to the northwest and west, Philistines to the southwest. Do the Gospels seek to exploit this old world connection? Yes. Fairly self-evidently with the terminology of Matthew 4:15, but more particularly with having Jesus stray all the way up to the antique Galilee for the story of the woman of Sidon, here, and the visit to Caesarea Philippi over here. In the story of the woman at Sidon, Matthew 15:21 to 28 and Mark 7:24 to 30, the whole point of the encounter is that Jesus is having salvational dealings with foreigners. Jesus' visit to the north in this story is a bringing of salvation northwards to foreigners, people who, in this view of things, are the spiritually disadvantaged. The visit to Caesarea Philippi, Matthew 16:13 to 20, Mark 8:27 to 29, comes soon after the journey to Sidon and functions as an elaboration of its significance. First of all, the name Caesarea Philippi is provocative. Judeans associate Caesars and the loving of horses, phil, love, hippos, horse, with their violent and militaristic northern neighbours. Secondly, what happens there is full of north-south theological precepts. It is there that Jesus raises with his disciples the question of his fundamental identity. Who do you say that I am? Matthew 16:15, Mark 8 to 29. The correct answer, you are the Christ, is furnished by Simon Peter, the man who is being positioned to be the one who takes Jesus' message to the Romans and to northerners generally. For his correct answer, Jesus dubs him Simon Bar Jonah, which is to say, a son of the prophet Jonah, the type for the person who brings faith to the north through a sign of Yahweh's power. See the book of Jonah, where Jonah brings Yahwistic belief to some Gentile sailors, the king of Assyria, and the people of Nineveh. This sign of Jonah, Jesus tells his disciples, is the only one that this wicked generation, which is always demanding signs, will ever see. Matthew 12:39 and 16:4. What follows this revelation of Jesus' identity at Caesarea Philippi in Matthew and Mark is Jesus' transfiguration on a mountain. Down here, Mount Tabor. Here we have a summarizing of the significance of the north-south interface. This is that liminal place where the merely human meets the divine. Or put in much simpler terms, the move northwards and outwards is in essence a sort of sacred impulsion and a sacred duty. What is the meaning of all these north-connected theological episodes from a purely historical point of view? They are, as we have said, positioning Peter and the disciples to take the Christian message to the northern Greco-Roman world. But there is a very great ideological sting to this mere moving north of notables. The north-connectedness of these episodes is to make Jesus, and through him, his disciples, after the passing of some decades, the suitable inheritors and purveyors of Jewish tradition, at a time when the actual Jewish authorities have been suppressed in the war against the Romans. Let me add to the above just one further comment, a comment in reference to my previous talk number 5 on Tarsus. I am asserting here that Jesus is associated with and said to come from Galilee for exactly the same reason that Paul is said to have come from Tarsus. Its liminal value. Now Nazareth. The what and where of Nazareth might at first glance seem to be less interesting. It's a town in Galilee, just south of Sepphoris, a major Galilean city, which intriguingly is never mentioned in the Gospels. Nazareth is famously where Jesus grew up. There is, however, a major curve to this story. It is provided by the Nazareth deniers. These are people who have raised their heads above the parapet quite recently to say that there was no such place as Nazareth before a Christian community settled there in the second half of the 1st century AD. I don't want to spend a lot of time on this, so I'll just quickly list their arguments. 1. No ancient historians or geographers mention Nazareth before the 4th century AD. 2. Nazareth is not mentioned in the Old Testament, the Talmud, or in the Apocrypha, and it does not appear in any rabbinic literature. And just by the way, the Talmud lists 63 towns in Galilee. 3. Nazareth was not included in the list of settlements of the tribe of Zebulun at Joshua 19:10-16, which gives 12 towns and 6 villages. 4. Nazareth is not included among the 45 cities of Galilee mentioned by Josephus, who, by his own account, is in this area during the Jewish War and was himself born in 37 AD. And archaeology. There is a lack of archaeological evidence at Nazareth for Assyrian, Babylonian, Persian, Hellenistic and early Roman times for excavations through to 1990. The type of tombs that have been found in Nazareth from the 1st century AD are called koch, plural kochim. There are 12 of them. For Galilee, this type of tomb only appears in the second half of the 1st century AD. C. Jesus' messianic move south. So far in this presentation of Jesus as an invader, we have looked at him as a northerner, so as either not Jewish, a foreigner, a Gentile, or as someone who is a liminal figure, someone who dwells at the fringes of the Jewish sanctum. But now it is time to say in what sense the journey he makes from the northern fringes to the south is a messianic invasion. The first thing to point out here is that if he's planning on invading Judea with just a few Galilean fishermen, then it's not going to work. His troops are not a fighting force, and he doesn't carry a sword himself, despite the often quoted Matthew 10:34. Do not think I have come to bring peace, but a sword. So, is it really an invasion at all? I think the answer is yes, but here we have to move into a realm in which the modern mind doesn't feel comfortable. Demonology. The invasion is a dislodging of demons. There are two distinct aspects to the dislodging. One, the dislodging of demons that inhabit actual men. And two, the attempt to dislodge the theological demons that lie in the hearts of the perceived to be oppressive Jewish authorities, the scribes, Pharisees, Sadducees, and Herodians. Apparently, the gospel writers saw both the sharp distinction between the two and also the continuum between them. This allows for a neat packaging up of theological precept and literary exposition. The north to south motion of the story can be structured by Jesus dealing with one and then the other. Whilst there are in the Gospels scribes and Pharisees up north and physically sick people down south, on the whole, it's a gratis of dealing first with people who have real, should one say psychiatric, problems and real physical afflictions, like being blind, and only then with the demonic Jewish authorities and their perceived to be oppressive doctrines and practices. So what exactly are Jesus' weapons during the course of the invasion? Words. and a certain capacity for performance. It's an art invasion. Jesus dialogues with demons, and his rather eccentric quotation of tradition to the Pharisees, and add in his use of parables and parable commentary, constitute a new kind of conquest. Jesus is a qualitatively new type of hero, an art-aware hero. And because he's an art-performing and art-aware hero, possibly even a magician, who can always draw a crowd even when he's dying, he is a fit spectacle for witnessing Greek eyes. Notice the peculiar idea in the Gospel of John that he has put off his big performance in Jerusalem until certain unnamed Greeks turn up. John 12:20. When they do turn up, he now has the right audience to witness his death and can make the declaration that his hour has finally come. In short, all Jesus' words and performances are a catalogue of his north to south victories, including over death, and are dedicated specifically to Greek eyes. D, Jesus' buddies, the tax collectors. And just a very quick note on this term. In the New Testament, the tax collectors are telonai. This is telos, end, and oneomai, by bargain. So they are deal concluders. In Sunday school, one is told that Jesus consorts with tax collectors because he wants to show how humble he is. And he's being humble because he is having dealings with the unclean and the lowest in the land. This raises the question of why he didn't choose to dine and lodge in the houses of actual poor people. On a rationalistic level, should one be happy with the demonstration of humility interpretation? I think he's consorting with them for theological reasons. He's consorting with them because they are in the same business as him. Tax collectors are caught up in the messianic talk and thinking behind the Gospels. Tax collectors, like the Messiah, are making ledgers straight and call individuals to account to pay penalties incurred. And more than this, they have definite northern connections. They are collecting Roman taxes, and if they aren't Romans themselves, that would be very unlikely out in this part of the Eastern Mediterranean, they are clients or are otherwise affiliated with Roman publicani, i.e. tax farmers or owners of a tax franchise that can only be granted in Rome itself. Now, to prove that this is not just my fertile imagination, and moreover to highlight the fact that there are serious problems with taking Sunday school's interpretations of ancient texts as the gospel truth, let's go to Matthew 18:23 and following. Therefore, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a king who wished to settle accounts with his servants. When he began the reckoning, one was brought to him who owed him 10,000 talents. And as he could not pay, his lord ordered him to be sold with his wife and children and all that he had, and payment to be made. So the servant fell on his knees, imploring him, Lord, have patience with me, and I will pay you everything. And out of pity for him, the lord of that servant released him and forgave him the debt. But that same servant... This well-known and terrific story continues with the only just reprieved servant, actually slave, Greek doulos, walking out of the reckoning and encountering a fellow servant who owes him a trivial amount. He demands payment, and when the sub-editor can't pay, calls for jailers. Other servants hear of this or witness this. They are shocked and inform the king. The king, disgusted with his previously favoured servant, reverses his reversed decision, and the ungrateful or wicked man is hauled away to be sold. There are some particularly noteworthy features of this parable for our purposes. Notice first of all the slightly odd detail that the king has significant financial dealings with his own servants or slaves. But, as if that weren't odd enough, notice the amount involved in the case of the putatively wicked servant. 10,000 talents. This is enough to have bought the entire real estate of several ancient cities. These slight peculiarities are, however, cunning elements in the sharp political message of the parable, a message of hardcore anti-Judaic propaganda. The at first specially privileged servant figures the Jews, a group who have been immoderately favoured with spiritual treasures by a generous and mostly benign deity, but who have abused their privileged status and power, especially with regard to the periphery-dwelling northerners, figured in the sub-debtor, who have only been favoured with the crumbs. So in summary, the point we're making here is that a tax collector is just like the Messiah. He could turn up at any time and call in debts. And he's got connections to the violent north. So watch out. Further to all this, I'll just mention parenthetically that it is quite frequently the case that devotees of a religion are considered to be in debt to a god. They are in debt for all the goods and services he provides. E. The case of Judas Iscariot, the southern fall guy. Most of Jesus' disciples have explicitly northern origins. Judas, however, is a southerner. He is from the town of Kerioth, hence his name Iscariot. And Kerioth is a town to the south of Jerusalem. His first name, Judas, might also hint at a southern identity as a Judean or a Judahite. Further to this, he's got southern affiliations. He seems to be somehow connected to the Jerusalem authorities. And, as everyone knows, he turns Jesus into those authorities. Another curious detail of his portrayal is that he is a treasurer of Jesus' group of disciples. Note especially the Gospel of John, where he is an embezzler of the group's funds, an abuser of his position of high trust within the group. John 12:6. He has, moreover, yet another connection to money, with the Gospels focusing on him being paid for his act of betrayal. Notice that when all these details of Judas' persona are put together, you end up with a northern biased perception of a southern Judaic type. Connected to high civilization, connected to finances, connected to treachery, and a saboteur of the northern invasion by cunningly being a part of it. Notice one more detail, a structural feature of the Gospels as a whole. If you take the Gospels in the chronological order that scholarship usually gives to them, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and then somewhat distantly John, a very clear pattern emerges. The texts become more Greek biased, more anti-Judaic, and give increasing attention to the person and role of Judas as an agent of evil. Hence, exactly the point we're trying to make in this talk, namely that the northward drift of civilization has a concomitant, but a lagging behind, northward drift in its perspective and preoccupations. F. In summary, on Jesus of Nazareth as a northern invader, in the baldest terms, Jesus is not Jewish. He comes from the periphery or beyond the northern borders of the realm of the claiming to have the keys to tradition Jews. He is an invader of their tradition. His invasion is directed against demons. His first victories are over actual demoniacs, but they are also over those demons which are imagined to reside within the physically sick and disabled. These victories take place generally in his own northern world. After this, he moves south to tackle the demonic authorities of Jerusalem. He has demimonde allies, the tax collectors, for the paradoxically highbrow purpose of indicating that the Messiah is like a tax or debt collector. He is destined to die because there is a Jewish enemy in his own ranks, Judas, and because the time is right. He is joined by Greek witnesses who can write up his story and eventually take his simplified and more Gentile-friendly religion to the north. Part 3, the Gospel of John. John chapters 2 and 4. The philosopher Heidegger had an interesting dictum which went, "What's the definition of a theologian?" Answer, someone who's satisfied with metaphors. And here in the Gospel of John, we need to be satisfied with metaphors because this particular text is something of a metaphor central for the whole New Testament enterprise. The point, however, that we are making today is that underneath the nice metaphors, there is something quite ruthless going on. It's an invasion, it's a takeover, it's a power grab. In the first instance, and following what we'll call biological imperatives, the Christian story is an invasion from the north. So, for the most part, Matthew, Mark, and Luke tell the story of a single journey that goes from north to south. But when we move to John, things are getting more complicated with regard to geography. And Jesus is running up and down Palestine like a what? Like a zealous festival attender. And that idea is more than hinted at in the text. But we're going to try to set aside that very literal idea for the moment and instead see in Jesus moving up and down the country something much more abstract, something to do with the whole passage of history and the whole passage of biblical history, the story that I call Northern Invaders and Southern Aggrandizers. One might consider, by way of comparison, the end of the book of Daniel, where history is painted as just such a patchwork, where kings of the north are ranged against kings of the south. God raising up, now one, now the other. Here is this alternating structure. Little explanation here, Bethany beyond the Jordan. John thinks that Bethany is 2 miles east of Jerusalem. See John 10:40, 11:18. So we're way down next to Jerusalem, then we're in Galilee, then we're back to Judea, then we're in Galilee again, then we're in Judea again, then we're in Galilee again, Judea, finally back by the Sea of Galilee. In the passages that we are looking at in chapters 2 and 4, the marriage at Cana and the woman at the well, the metaphor of choice for expounding the invasions and aggrandizements is the bridegroom. More particularly, it's the revelation of the bridegroom. The previously unrecognized and yet to be acknowledged suitable husband moves in to his territory. Chapter 2, the marriage at Cana. 2 things here to begin with, marriages and Cana. First, marriages. In Greek antiquity, marriages are not the mutual arrangements of today. The word used in Greek for marry is ago, to lead. A man leads a woman. The idea is that after negotiations between 2 families, a man goes to the prospective bride's house and gets final permission from her father, brothers, male relatives generally, to take possession of the bride and to lead her back to his own house. There she will reside under the roof of and in the custody of his male relatives. So marriage in antiquity is above all else a takeover. And point number 1, the politically incorrect males of antiquity carry out in a marriage a takeover of property. Point 2, Cana. It sounds to me like Canaan, and I think that is what it would have sounded like to people in earlier times. Moreover, Canaan has a very specific resonance for Jewish ears. Owing to the Jewish absorption of Israelite traditions, Canaan is the place that, in the distant past, was successfully invaded so that later generations of devout Yahwistic worshippers would have a place to live. Therefore, add point 1 to point 2, and Cana is a suitable place for a theological takeover to be acted out. This is the opening to the story. On the third day, there was a marriage at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus also was invited to the marriage with his disciples. When the wine failed, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "O woman, what have you to do with me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." John 2, 1-5. What I'm particularly drawing your attention to here is the extraordinary, "O woman, what have you to do with me?" The bleedingly obvious answer to this question is that she is his mother. But this is a gospel where literal truth is derogated and is in fact only for dummies. Jesus must mean something else. But what? Well, it helps to know, as any pious Jew would have done, that Jesus is quoting the Old Testament, which is what you have to do if you are claiming to be the meaning of all tradition. What he is specifically referring to, perhaps somewhat weirdly to our way of thinking, is martial confrontation. The Hebrew locution being employed here is literally, "What to you and what to me?" It's what you say to an enemy when hostilities are pending. You're asking, how is it that this state of affairs has arisen between, say, your invading army and my city? Compare Judges 11:12, Jephthah's message to the king of the Ammonites. Somewhat intriguingly, this locution is exactly what demons say to Jesus, because they feel he is besieging them and that he has come to invade the person who they are currently lodged in, body and soul, and that he is going to kill them or drive them out and thereby obtain possession of the host human being. Here in the Cana story, however, Jesus' hostility is all based on his mother's innocent sublunar observation that they have no wine. Jesus, who correctly, in the gospel context, thinks that everything is about him, or as the comedians Kath and Kim might say, thinks he's God's gift, interprets the observation, "They have no wine," as an insult. This is because he is the life and salvation of the party, the real bridegroom and the true vine. The bridegroom idea is only clarified later by John the Baptist, chapter 3, verse 9, and the true vine idea is only clarified for the reader at chapter 15, verse 1. In the rest of the story, Jesus turns water into wine. It is a sort of theophany, a manifestation of his power or true self. And the episode ends with an ironic quote. Back in the real world, the sublunar and presumably nonplussed actual bridegroom gets congratulations from the steward for his back-to-front methods. Every man serves the good wine first, and when men have drunk freely, then the poor wine. But you have kept the good wine till now. John 2:10. In other words, the whole story is a gloss on issues we have been talking about relating to biblical tradition. Jesus is taking over in the north, manifesting his power for an invasion, and participating in a narration where the great, good, and life-affirming turns up in the end to dislodge an unsatisfactory state of affairs. Jesus, like all salvational heroes, is a tonic and a pick-me-up for civilization. A little extra something you put in whatever it is you are drinking. Chapter 4. The Samaritan woman at the well. Now when the Lord knew that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and departed again to Galilee. he had to pass through Samaria. So he came to a city of Samaria called Sychar, near the field that Jacob gave to his own son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and so Jesus, wearied as he was with his journey, sat down beside the well. It was about the 6th hour. There came a woman of Samaria to draw water. Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink," for his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. The Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask a drink of me, a woman of Samaria? For Jews have no dealings with Samaritans." Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." The woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob, who gave us the well and drank from it himself, and his sons and his cattle?" Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will thirst again. But whoever drinks of the water that I shall give him will never thirst. The water that I shall give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." The woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water, that I may not thirst, nor come here to draw." Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." The woman answered him, "I have no husband." Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, 'I have no husband,' for you have had 5 husbands, and he whom you now have is not your husband. This you said truly." The woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, and you say that in Jerusalem is the place where men ought to worship." Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me, the hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and now is, when the true worshippers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For such the Father seeks to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and truth." The woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming," he who is called Christ. "When he comes, he will show us all things." Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am he." John 4, 1-26. In the Cana story, I had to squeeze out a connection between Cana and Canaan for the story to make sense theologically or biologically. Here, you were just basically told straight out that we are moving through a meditation on the significance of the Old Testament, and more precisely on the story of Jacob seeking a suitable wife at the well. So again, we're dealing with the Jesus' bridegroom metaphor. But notice a pointed change in context. The Cana story is Jesus in a northern locale where he is the master of that precious commodity water, and where he is showing that he can transform water into something even better. Whereas the woman at the well is a southern story. He's coming up from the south and he is in need of a drink. So the two stories are in some degree contrastive. But a further qualitative differentiation, in the second story, a lot is being made of the fact that Jesus comes from the south. The Samaritan woman has, as the identity philosophers would say, concretized his identity as a Jewish southerner. Paradoxically, Jesus is happy with that. This new southern identity allows him to play the north-south game in the role of the south player. He's now the salvationally confident Jew who lords it over Gentiles and half or quarter Jews like this Samaritan woman, and is able and ready to tell them where they are going wrong. The principal aspect of where they are going wrong is that they don't worship at Jerusalem. The Samaritan woman brings that up even before he can do it, perhaps to keep up her end of the conversation. But he then goes straight into the Old Testament trope that Samaria, for which she is a figure, yes, her identity can be concretized as well, is an unfaithful bride. And he completes his invasive southern aggrandizement with some more anti-Sumerian cant, namely that she has had 5 husbands. These husbands are Assyria, Babylonia, Persia, Greece, and Rome. So, a few final words about the 2 stories. With these examples in John, we are hoping to present the notion that Jesus is to be seen as a northern invader. But this invasion turns out to be the first term in a paradox. Jesus, as well as being a northern invader, is also a southern aggrandizer. To explain this more clearly, we need to backtrack a little. The idea of Jesus making a resurrection in the north, in my terminology, morphing into a southerner who heads north, was already present in the first 3 Gospels. Matthew and Mark mention a return to Galilee as a goal for Jesus after death. And Luke develops the idea of a northward bound post-death task for Christianity in the person of Paul, in what is thought to have been a conjoined Luke Acts. But it is John writing at a much greater distance from the traumatic events of 66 to 70 AD and the complete collapse of Judaic power, who sees in the Christian story the opportunity to render the traditional sacred material in summary as a seesawing north-south movement of an alleged founding spirit. Conclusion. In this talk, we looked at the question of Jesus of Nazareth as a northern invader. As a preliminary, we gave 3 theoretical underpinnings for the invasion idea. In Theoretic 1, we looked at the northern drift of civilization with the attendant phenomenon of literary lag. In Theoretic 2, we looked at the question of how to write a Bible and the necessity of something like concept God. In Theoretic 3, we tried to combine Theoretics 1 and 2 to join history and literary lag with monolithic, God-driven literary construction in order to tackle the genre question of what a Bible is. My suggestions are salvational epic and extended paradox. Then we focused specifically on the matter of paradox and its biblical expression of back-to-frontism, the story that is intentionally told around the wrong way. We gave the examples of Cain and Abel. The sedentary agriculturalist kills the meat-associated transhumant. The left-handed men of Gibeah, bad men, made possible the rise of salvation-critical Benjamin. And Paul of Tarsus, the chastiser of Christianity, becomes its champion. Then we moved on to our headline topic of Jesus as a northern invader. Concept Jesus is a summarizing portrait of biblical procedure. He is an extended paradox. He is the inheritor of a future northern world that goes back in time, so to speak, to confront a cursed and superseded, and cursed because superseded, Judaism. Because wrong states of affairs have to precede right states of affairs, he is killed by the about-to-be suppressed Judaism, but then bounces back to return in glory to Galilee and beyond, where he can be called on eternally to deal with the demons that haunt humanity. The story of the marriage at Cana and the Samaritan woman at the well can stand, we think, as an illustrative epitome of the north-south zigzag. As a final reflection, and by way of pulling back from literature to biology, I'd like to finish with this. The Christian story is a biological metaphor. All the northern invaders of real history are sowing the seeds of their own destruction. All their furious invasions are, paradoxically, hastening the inexorable, ultimately one-way, process of high civilization as it heads north. Thanks.